Have you ever taken a vaccine? Have you ever benefited from research into cancer or AIDS or gene mapping or in vitro fertilization? If you have, then you, and almost every person alive today, owe a profound debt of gratitude to one woman. Her name was Henrietta Lacks. She was a poor black tobacco farmer from Virginia who died of an aggressive cancer in 1951. And her cells, taken from her body without her knowledge and without her consent, became one of the most important and revolutionary tools in the history of modern medicine. They're called HeLa cells, and they are immortal. Rebecca Skloot's breathtaking book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, is not just the story of these incredible cells, it is the story of the woman they came from, a woman whose own life was almost completely erased from the scientific history she made possible. It is the story of the family she left behind, who for decades had no idea that a part of their mother was still alive, being bought and sold by the millions in labs all over the world. And it is a deep philosophical and ethically explosive inquiry into the dark history of medical research, the nature of informed consent, and the profound question of who owns the living pieces of our own bodies. This is the story of the ghost in the medical machine. To understand the story of the HeLa cells, you must first understand the story of the woman, Henrietta. The book begins by painting a vivid human portrait of a life that science would later reduce to a simple four-letter code name. Henrietta Lacks was a vibrant, beautiful, and deeply caring woman, a wife and a mother of 5. She grew up in the small rural town of Clover, Virginia, working the same tobacco fields that her enslaved ancestors had once worked. She was known for her generosity, for her love of dancing, and for the way she was always taking care of others. In 1951, after giving birth to her 5th child, Henrietta went to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, one of the few top-tier hospitals in the country that would treat poor black patients at the time. She had a painful lump, what she called a knot, inside her. The diagnosis was a devastating one, an incredibly aggressive form of cervical cancer. During her radiation treatments, a doctor, without telling her what he was doing or asking for her permission, took a small sample of her tumor and sent it down the hall to the lab of a scientist named Dr. George Gay. For decades, Dr. Gay and other scientists had been trying to achieve a kind of holy grail of medical research. They were trying to grow human cells in a lab, but every cell line they tried had failed. The cells would divide a few times and then, inevitably, they would die. But Henrietta's cells were different. They were unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. They were astonishingly resilient. They were aggressive, and they never stopped growing. While other cells would die within a few days, Henrietta's cells doubled their numbers every 24 hours. They were, for all intents and purposes, immortal. Dr. Gay, following the standard scientific naming convention, labeled the sample with the first 2 letters of the patient's first and last names. He called them HeLa. He had found his holy grail. But he had done so by taking a piece of a woman's body without her consent, an act that was common practice at the time, but one that would have profound and painful consequences for decades to come. While Henrietta Lacks' own body was being ravaged by the cancer that would kill her just a few months later, her cells were beginning a new, miraculous, and immortal life in a lab. The story of what happened next is a story of one of the greatest contributions to medical science in the 20th century. Dr. Gay immediately recognized the incredible potential of these immortal cells. He began sharing them, for free, with other scientists all over the world. HeLa cells became the workhorse of cellular biology. They were tough, they were reliable, and they grew like weeds. For the first time, scientists had a stable, consistent, and endlessly regenerating supply of human cells that they could use for experiments. The breakthroughs that followed were staggering. In 1952, the HeLa cells were used to help develop the polio vaccine. Scientists used the cells to test Jonas Salk's vaccine on a massive scale, a critical step that led to the near eradication of one of the most feared diseases of the 20th century. Henrietta's cells helped save the lives of countless children, and that was just the beginning. HeLa cells were sent into space on the first space missions to see what would happen to human cells in zero gravity. They were used to develop chemotherapy for treating cancer. They were instrumental in the development of cloning, of in vitro fertilization, and of gene mapping. They have been used in research for AIDS, for Parkinson's disease, and for countless other conditions. There have been tens of thousands of scientific papers published based on research using her cells. They have been bought and sold by the billions. They have become a multi-million-dollar industry. Henrietta's cells are, without exaggeration, one of the most important medical tools ever discovered. But for the first 25 years of their incredible journey, the world knew them only as HeLa. The woman they came from, her story, her family, her very name, had been completely erased. While Henrietta's cells were changing the world, her children were growing up in a world of poverty, confusion, and profound loss. After Henrietta's death, her husband Day was left to raise their 5 children alone. He was a poor, uneducated man who was overwhelmed by the task. The children's lives were hard. They were often left to fend for themselves, and some suffered from abuse. They grew up with only a few, faint memories of their vibrant, loving mother. They had no idea that a part of her was still alive. The emotional heart of The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks is the story of her youngest daughter, Deborah Lacks. Deborah was just a toddler when her mother died, and she grew up with a deep and aching void in her life. She was haunted by questions about the mother she never knew. Who was she? What was she like? And how did she die? The family's world was turned upside down in the 1970s, more than 2 decades after Henrietta's death. Scientists, in the course of their research, discovered that the HeLa cells were so aggressive that they were contaminating other cell cultures all over the world. To solve this problem, they needed to get DNA samples from Henrietta's living relatives to create a genetic map of her family. One day, out of the blue, the Lacks family started getting phone calls from researchers at Johns Hopkins. This is how they learned for the first time that their mother's cells were still alive. The experience was deeply confusing, terrifying, and traumatic. They were not scientists. They were a poor family with a deep and historically justified distrust of the medical establishment. They didn't understand what cells were. They pictured their mother, whole and alive, being experimented on in a laboratory, and no one took the time to explain it to them in a way they could understand. What followed was a heartbreaking and infuriating story of the collision between 2 completely different worlds. On one side you had the world of big science and medicine, a world that saw the HeLa cells as a valuable but impersonal scientific tool, a product to be studied and sold. On the other side, you had the Lacks family, who saw the cells as a sacred, living, and miraculous part of their mother and grandmother. This collision led to a series of further exploitations. Researchers, in their quest for genetic markers, took more blood samples from Henrietta's children, but the consent forms they used were confusing and misleading. The family believed they were being tested for the cancer that killed their mother. They had no idea that their own genetic information was being taken, stored, and used in research all over the world, also without their consent. They saw their mother's name in scientific papers, and heard about the millions of dollars that were being made from her cells, and they were understandably angry and confused. They were living in poverty, some of them unable to afford their own health insurance, while a piece of their mother had created a massive industry from which they had never seen a single penny. The story of the Lacks family is a powerful and damning indictment of a medical and scientific establishment that, for a long time, failed to see the human beings at the heart of their research. It exposes the deep and painful history of medical racism in America, a history that has created a profound and justified distrust of doctors and hospitals within the African American community. The Lacks family was not just a scientific curiosity, they were a family, grieving for their mother, and their grief and their questions were repeatedly ignored and dismissed by a system that saw them only as a source of valuable data. This is where the author, Rebecca Skloot, enters the story. Skloot first learned about the HeLa cells in a biology class as a teenager, and she was haunted by a simple question: who was Henrietta? She spent the next decade of her life on a relentless, obsessive quest to answer that question. The process was not easy. The Lacks family, after their negative experiences with the medical establishment and the media, was deeply suspicious of her. It took years of patient, persistent, and deeply respectful work for her to earn their trust, particularly the trust of Henrietta's daughter Deborah. The relationship between Rebecca Skloot, the white, educated science writer, and Deborah Lacks, the fiery, funny, and deeply traumatized daughter of Henrietta, becomes the central narrative of the second half of the book. Together, they embark on a journey to uncover the story of the real Henrietta. It is a detective story, a quest to restore the history and the humanity to the woman who had been erased. They travel back to the small town of Clover, Virginia, and they talk to Henrietta's cousins and childhood friends. They piece together a portrait of a woman who was more than just a cell culture. They find her medical records, and for the first time, Deborah begins to understand the science of what happened to her mother, both the cancer that killed her and the immortal cells that lived on. In one of the most powerful and moving scenes in the book, Skloot takes Deborah to a lab at Johns Hopkins. There, a kind and patient researcher shows Deborah her mother's cells under a microscope. He lets her hold a vial of the living cells. In that moment, Deborah is finally able to connect the abstract scientific reality of HeLa with the warm human reality of the mother she lost. It is a moment of profound and deeply earned healing. The final message of The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks is a story about the complex and often fraught relationship between science, ethics, and humanity. It is a powerful argument for a more just and compassionate approach to medical research, one that never forgets the human beings at the heart of the story. But it is also a story of legacy. Henrietta Lacks, a woman who was born into poverty and died in a segregated hospital ward, a woman whose contribution to science was erased for decades, has in the end achieved a kind of immortality that is both literal and literary. Her cells continue to save lives all over the world, and thanks to this book, her story, the story of her life, her family, and the profound injustice done to them, is now a permanent and essential part of our history. It is a deep and powerful inquiry into the places where science and justice collide. If you believe that we have a profound ethical responsibility to remember the human stories behind our greatest scientific achievements, then you are in the right place. Welcome to Geeky Philosopher. Subscribe, and let's continue to explore the vital intersection of science, philosophy, and our shared humanity.